In 1991, in the car park of a Manchester pub, a young man of just 22 who believed he was untouchable was caught in an ambush and never walked away. The man later put on trial was found not guilty, and no one was ever held to account. In this city, that was not unusual. It was the rule. For 60 years, Manchester has produced some of the most feared crime families in Britain. Some ruled entire neighbourhoods through fear alone. Some turned ordinary streets into war zones. And the most famous name of all may never have truly been a crime family at all. This is the story of those families, from a 1960s legend to the gangs who tore Moss Side apart, to a father and son undone by a single secret phone. We will follow the bosses, the bitter feuds, and how almost every one of them eventually fell. Section 1. The Quality Street Gang. To understand how Manchester became one of the most talked about cities in British crime history, you have to start with a group that might not have been a real crime group at all. They were called the Quality Street Gang. The name sounds almost friendly, and that is part of the puzzle. For decades, people in Manchester have argued about who these men really were. Some say they were the most powerful crew the city ever produced. Others say they were just a handful of well-dressed friends who liked to drink and a laugh and nothing more. Both versions come from people who were actually around at the time, and that is what makes the whole thing so strange. Start with the name, because even that has more than one story behind it. The most popular one goes back to the 1960s and a television advert for Quality Street chocolates. The advert showed a group of smartly dressed characters with playful names, and the whole message was about doing things with style. In Manchester, a group of local men also dressed sharp and carried themselves like they owned every room they walked into. As the story goes, one day they strolled into a pub, someone looked up and called out that the Quality Street Gang had arrived. The name stuck. There is a second, less flattering version too. It says a few of the men were on the heavy side, so the chocolate box nickname fit for a different reason. Nobody can say which story is the right one. What most accounts agree on is where they came from. Most of the men were from Ancoats, a tough, tight-knit part of inner Manchester where everyone knew everyone. In a place like that, a reputation could open doors or slam them shut. The men at the centre of the group were not wild teenagers. They were grown adults, often described as local businessmen, who moved easily between the legal world and the shadier world sitting just beneath it. Here is where the real disagreement begins. Some senior police officers in Greater Manchester were convinced the Quality Street Gang sat behind a huge share of the serious crime in the city through the 1960s and 1970s. In their eyes, this was the crew that planned the big jobs and pulled the strings from the background. But there is one fact that makes that claim very hard to prove, and your essay should never skip past it. In all the years the gang was said to be active, not a single member was ever arrested and found guilty of running an organised crime group. No convictions, no court case that ever made the label stick. For a crew supposedly running the city, that is a massive hole, and it has led some people, police included, to ask whether the Quality Street Gang as a criminal power ever truly existed. That hole is why the legends grew so large. When the facts are thin, stories rush in to fill the empty space. The most famous one involves the Cray twins, the feared brothers who controlled a big slice of London at the time. The tale says the Crays wanted to move into Manchester and sent a man north to lean on a club owner for protection money. The owner supposedly replied that he was already looked after and that any complaints could be taken up with the Quality Street Gang. The gang then turned up, had a quiet word, and put the London man straight back on a train home. After that, the story claims, the Crays never bothered with Manchester again. It is a brilliant tale. It is also one that historians treat with caution, because no solid proof has ever been offered. You can include it, but only as legend, never as fact. The group even brushed up against one of the biggest police scandals of the era. In the mid-1980s, a very senior Greater Manchester officer named John Stalker was suspended from duty. One of the accusations against him was that he had been seen at social events where members of the Quality Street gang were also present. Stalker was later cleared, but the episode shows how the gang sat right on the line between the underworld and respectable society. Their power, if it was real, came partly from who they knew and where they were seen, not only from anything they did. There are even pop culture footnotes. Some people believe a famous rock anthem about the boys being back in town was inspired by this very group, partly because the singer had family ties to a Manchester hotel the men were known to visit. Like so much of this story, it is a lovely idea with almost no hard proof behind it. So what are we actually left with? A group of sharp-dressed men from Ancoats, police who were certain they were dangerous, and other voices just as certain they were harmless. A tall stack of colourful stories and barely any court records to match them. The truth most likely sits somewhere in the middle. These were probably well-connected men who made money on the edges of the law, who loved their reputation, and who were clever enough never to get caught in a way that stuck. In doing so, they became the blueprint for the Manchester gangster, the smiling, well-dressed local figure that everyone fears and nobody can quite lay a finger on. That blueprint is the real gift the Quality Street gang handed the city. They built the template, the idea of the untouchable local face. But the men who followed them would not be remembered for clever stories swapped over pints in a pub. The myth ends here. The next group left no room for doubt, because they left behind what the Quality Street men never did: real victims, frightened witnesses, and case files full of names and dates. At the centre of it all stood a young leader known as White Tony, and he would be gone before his 23rd birthday. Section 2. The Cheetham Hill Gang and the Fall of White Tony Johnson. If the Quality Street Gang was a story half made of legend, what came next was painfully real. By the 1980s, a new kind of crew had grown up in the north of the city, in an area called Cheetham Hill. People knew them as the Cheetham Hill Gang, though on the street they were often called the Hillbillies. They were not interested in clever pub stories or stylish reputations. They wanted money, territory, and respect, and they were willing to go a long way to get all three. The Cheetham Hill crew built their name on three things: raids on businesses, control of the trade inside the city's nightclubs, and the fear they could put into people. They worked out of estates around Cheetham Hill, and over time they grew into one of the most powerful groups in Manchester. To make money flow their way, they leaned on the dealers in other parts of the city, especially the south, demanding a cut of the profits. If those dealers refused, the threat was simple and understood by everyone involved. At the centre of this crew was a young man with one of the most unusual nicknames in British crime, White Tony. His real name was Anthony Johnson, born in Manchester in 1968. The nickname came from a plain fact. Most of the people around him in the gang were black, and he was white, so the name stuck and followed him everywhere. He was not a big man, but he was strong, quick, and afraid of no one, and in that world, a name for fearlessness can carry you a very long way. What very few people knew at the time is that White Tony came from a family already marked by one of the most infamous cases in British history. His mother, Susan, was only 15 when he was born. Through her side of the family, she was the stepsister of a boy named Keith Bennett. In 1964, 12-year-old Keith was on his way to visit his grandmother when he was taken by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the pair behind the notorious Moors case. Keith was never found. His mother, Winnie Johnson, spent the rest of her life searching for him. So before White Tony ever picked a side in a gang war, his family had already been touched by the darkest story Manchester had ever known. White Tony made his own name in the coldest way possible. In early 1988, a young man from a rival South Manchester crew named Anthony Gardner was attacked outside a late-night drinking spot and did not survive. White Tony was widely believed to be the person responsible, and although the full truth of that night has always been argued over, the event did exactly what such things do in that world. It marked him out. From then on, he was seen as someone to be feared, and his standing inside the Cheetham Hill gang grew quickly. The rivalry that defined his short life was between Cheetham Hill in the north and the crews of Moss Side in the south. The two sides clashed over money and over pride, and the tension only got worse as the years went on. White Tony pushed hard at the Moss Side crews, sensing weakness and wanting to take advantage of it. He became so wary of being attacked himself that he was said to have started wearing body armor, which tells you everything about how dangerous his everyday life had become. This was no longer about street fights. This was a war, and everyone in it knew the price of losing. That price caught up with White Tony on the 22nd of February, 1991. He was just 22 years old. He had gone to the car park of a pub in Cheetham Hill called the Penny Black, with an associate alongside him. The pub itself was reported to have ties to the Noonan family, which made the choice of spot anything but random. It was a trap. He was ambushed, and despite trying to get away, he did not make it out of that car park alive. The attack was quick, planned, and ruthless, and it sent a shockwave through the city's underworld, because White Tony was supposed to be untouchable. What happened afterwards is the part that links this whole story together. The man put on trial for ending White Tony's life was Desmond Noonan, a name that will come up again and again in this series, because the Noonan family would go on to become one of the most feared names in all of Manchester. He was acquitted. No one was ever held to account in court for what happened in that car park, and the case became one more example of how, in this world, the truth often dies in silence, while the people who know it stay quiet. White Tony was buried in Southern Cemetery in the south of the city. He was barely out of his teens, a young man from a family already scarred by tragedy, who chose a path that almost guaranteed an early ending. He is remembered today not because he built anything that lasted, but because his rise and his fall captured exactly what Manchester was turning into at the start of the 1990s. A city where teenagers carried the kind of fear and threat that should never have been in their hands at all. Cheetham Hill did not fall with him. Through the rest of the 1990s, it stayed one of the strongest forces in the city, a reminder that here, no single person was ever the whole story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But White Tony was only one front in a much bigger conflict. South of the city centre, in the streets and estates of Moss Side, two crews were tearing each other apart in a feud so relentless that it would earn Manchester a grim new nickname. To understand how bad it really got, we have to go to Moss Side and to the rise of the Pepperhill crew. Section 3. The Pepperhill Mob and the Doddington Gang. To reach the next chapter of this story, we leave the north of the city behind and travel south to a part of Manchester called Moss Side. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Moss Side became the most fought-over patch of ground in the whole region. At the heart of it sat the Alexandra Park estate, a maze of homes, walkways and blind corners that would soon become one of the most dangerous addresses in Britain. The first major crew to rise here took its name from a pub. The Pepperhill pub sat on the east side of the estate, and the young men who gathered around it became known as the Pepperhill Mob. They were mostly local lads, many of them teenagers, and at first they were just another tight group of friends from a poor part of the city. What changed everything was money. By the late 1980s, the estate had turned into a gold mine for the illegal supply business, and the Pepperhill crew was sitting right on top of it. By some estimates, the trade running through their patch was worth around £11 million a year. That kind of money does not stay quiet for long. Up in the north, the older and more established Cheetham Hill gang noticed what was happening in Moss Side, and they wanted their share. So they did what powerful crews do. They demanded a cut, a kind of tax on every pound the southern dealers made, backed up by the threat of force if anyone refused to pay. For a while, it must have seemed like an easy win for the bigger, scarier name from the north. But the Pepper Hill mob did not roll over. They were young, they were rich, and they were heavily equipped, and they decided they would rather fight than hand over their earnings. What followed was a long, ugly struggle between North and South, between Cheetham Hill and Moss Side, fought out in the streets with fists, and far worse. One of the saddest early losses in that struggle was a young man named Anthony Gardner, attacked at the start of 1988 in an event we touched on earlier. He was from the Moss side of the war, and his loss was an early sign of just how far both sides were willing to go. When the police finally turned their full attention to the Pepper Hill pub and shut it down, the crew did not disappear. They simply moved. A short distance away sat a street called Doddington Close, and the gang reformed around it. From that point on, they were known by a new name, the Doddington Gang, taken from the street itself, even if the spelling drifted a little over time. The pub was gone, but the people and the power behind it were exactly the same. This is one of the most important lessons in the whole Manchester story. You can close a building, you cannot close a network. For a few years, the Doddington crew, led by a figure named Delroy Brown, stood as one of the strongest forces in South Manchester. They had survived the pressure from the north, they had a steady stream of income, and they had a fearsome reputation. If the story had ended there, it might have been remembered as a simple tale of one gang holding its ground. Instead, the real disaster was just beginning, and this time it would not come from the north. It would come from right next door. On the very same Alexandra Park estate, another crew had been growing in strength, a group that would become known as the Gooch. At first, the two sides had worked together and even traded with one another. The split, when it came, was about loyalty. The Gooch had close ties to the Cheetham Hill gang, the same northern crew the Doddington had fought so hard against. To the Doddington, dealing with Cheetham Hill was the same as helping the enemy, and they made it clear that nobody in South Manchester should be doing business with the North. The Gooch refused to be told what to do, and that refusal lit a fuse that would burn for the next 20 years. The estate split clean in two. The Gooch held the west side, the Doddington held the east. A single housing estate where families lived ordinary lives and children played in the same parks became a front line with an invisible border running through the middle of it. Step onto the wrong side and you could be in serious danger, simply because of where you happened to stand. By 1992, the trouble had grown so bad that the newspapers gave Manchester a grim new nickname, one that swapped the proud name of the city for the very thing now tearing it apart. The label was cruel, and many locals hated it, because most people in Moss Side were decent and had nothing to do with any of this. But the nickname stuck, and for years it shaped how the rest of the country saw the area. That same year, the police launched a major effort called Operation China, sweeping up members from both sides and forcing a short pause. Some of the older heads even tried to make peace, sitting down to talk and arranging friendly football matches to cool tempers. For a brief moment, it looked like calm might return. It did not last. The peace was fragile, the money was still there, and the hatred between the two sides ran far too deep to be settled by a handshake or a kickabout. The Doddington had a rival now that would not back down, and that rival would prove to be one of the most ruthless and organised crews the city had ever produced. To understand how Moss Side became a name spoken with real fear across Britain, we have to look closely at the gang on the other side of that invisible line. They were younger, hungrier, and would soon become the most feared crew in the entire city. We have to talk about the Gooch. Section 4. The Gooch Close Gang. Of all the names to come out of Moss Side, none would become more feared than the Gooch. They took their name from Gooch Close, a street on the west side of the same Alexandra Park estate where the Doddington crew ruled the East. Most of the young men who made up the gang grew up within a few streets of one another, which is part of what made them so tight and so hard to break. They were not a loose collection of friends. They were organised, disciplined in their own way, and willing to do almost anything to control the streets they came from. The Gooch grew out of the same world as everyone else in this story, the late 1980s trade that turned a poor housing estate into a place worth fighting over. What set them apart was how far they were prepared to take it, and how long they were prepared to keep going. Their feud with the Doddington did not last months, or even a few years. It lasted on and off for the better part of 2 decades, passing down from one set of young men to the next like a family business nobody wanted to inherit, but everybody did. As the years went on, the Gooch spread out beyond their original patch, reaching into areas like Whalley Range, Fallowfield, Old Trafford and Hume. They also produced a younger, even wilder offshoot, known as the Young Gooch, a new generation that earned a frightening reputation almost overnight. The police eventually targeted this younger crew in an operation called Operation Eagle, and 5 of its members were sent to prison for a combined total of more than 40 years. But even that did not stop the main gang. For every member taken off the streets, another seemed ready to step up. To understand how dangerous the Gooch had become, you have to look at the 2 men who came to lead them. Their names were Colin Joyce and Lee Amos, known on the streets as Piggy and Cabbo. By the 2000s, these 2 sat at the very top of the gang, and the trail of harm linked to them would eventually become the focus of one of the most important court cases in Manchester history. Back in the year 2000, the pair had already been caught by police at a house in Moss Side, found with a frightening collection of equipment that left no doubt about what they were involved in. But catching them was one thing. Making a case that would stick was something else entirely. The turning point came after 2 young men lost their lives in attacks linked to the gang. The first was a man named Yukal Chin. Sometime later, at the wake held to mourn him, the Gooch struck again, carrying out a planned drive-by attack on the mourners. That attack claimed the life of Tyrone Gilbert, who was just 24 years old, and left another man hurt. Targeting a funeral wake, a place where grieving families gather, showed exactly how little the gang now cared about any line that was supposed to exist even in their own world. Tyrone Gilbert's story is one of the saddest in the whole Manchester saga, because his family had already been through this once before. Years earlier, his brother had lost his life in a separate clash between rival crews. 2 young men from the same family, gone in 2 different chapters of the same long, pointless war. It is the kind of detail that strips away any sense of glamour and shows these feuds for what they really were, an engine that kept eating the young people of the area year after year. After the loss of Chin and Gilbert, Greater Manchester Police launched what was, at the time, the biggest organised crime investigation the force had ever attempted. This was no longer about chasing street dealers. Detectives set out to take apart the entire gang from the top down, starting with Joyce and Amos and working their way through the ranks. They built their case slowly and carefully, relying on 2 things in particular. First, a number of former gang members agreed to break the wall of silence and give evidence. Second, the investigators pieced together a vast web of around 80,000 phone calls and text messages, an electronic trail that the gang had no idea was being followed. Piece by piece, that trail turned the gang's own confidence against them. In April 2009, after a trial lasting around 6 months at Liverpool Crown Court, the case finally landed. Colin Joyce and Lee Amos were found guilty in connection with what happened to Yukal Chin and Tyrone Gilbert, along with the attack at the wake and other serious offences. Several other senior members were convicted alongside them. Joyce and Amos were handed life terms, and for the first time in 20 years, the leadership of the Gooch had been dismantled in a courtroom rather than on the street. The police called it a turning point in the long fight against gang trouble in South Manchester, and for once, the claim was true. The fall of the Gooch leadership did not magically fix Moss Side, and smaller crews and rivalries would continue to cause harm for years afterwards. But the back of the old order had been broken. The two men who had ruled through fear were now facing the rest of their lives behind bars, and the message was clear. The age of the untouchable gang boss in Moss Side was finally coming to an end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Yet while the gangs of the South fought over single streets and estates, a very different kind of operation had been growing across the whole of Manchester. This one was not built around a postcode. It was built around a surname, a single family whose name alone could empty a room. To meet them, we have to go back to the city centre, and to the Noonans. Section 5. The Noonan family. Everything we have looked at so far has been about territory, north against south, one estate against another. The Noonans were different. They were not tied to a single street or a single postcode. They were a family, related by birth, and for around 20 years their surname carried a weight across the whole of Manchester that no estate gang could match. The family had Irish roots and grew up in Manchester, and there were several brothers, but 3 of them sat at the centre of the story. Desmond, often called Desi, Damien, and Dominic, who would become the most famous of all. Each played a different role, but together they built something that the single gangs of Moss Side or Cheetham Hill never quite managed. They built a reputation that followed the name itself, so that the word Noonan alone was often enough to settle an argument before it started. Their rise began on the doors. In the 1980s, Manchester's nightlife was booming, and whoever controlled the security on the doors of the clubs controlled a huge amount of money and influence. Desmond started out as a doorman, and with a hard reputation behind him, he and his family slowly took over more and more of that work. Before long, much of the security across Manchester's club scene answered to the Noonans in one way or another. Once you control the doors, you control who comes in, what gets sold inside, and who is allowed to operate. It was a quiet kind of power, and it was extremely profitable. But the Noonans were never only about doors. Dominic, in his younger days, was sent to prison for 15 years for his part in a raid on a bank in Cheetham Hill. While he was locked up, his brothers kept the family business running and built links with other major crews around the city, including the Cheetham Hill gang and the gangs of Salford. The family largely stayed out of the Moss Side wars, though Desmond was connected to people who supplied the kind of equipment those wars were fought with. They cared less about fighting over a patch of grass than about being the people everyone else had to deal with. This is where the Noonan name connects back to a story we have already told. When White Tony Johnson was attacked in that Cheetham Hill car park in 1991, it was Desmond Noonan who was put on trial for it. He was found not guilty and walked free. Whatever the truth of that night, it showed how close the Noonans sat to the city's most serious events, and how hard it was to make anything stick to them. That difficulty was not an accident. It was a method. Desmond, in particular, became known for making sure that cases against the family fell apart before they ever reached a verdict. Over the years, he picked up convictions connected to leaning on witnesses and interfering with the people meant to judge him. And again, key witnesses suddenly decided they could not testify after all. In a courtroom, fear can be just as powerful as evidence, and the Noonans understood that better than almost anyone. How dangerous were they really? The honest answer is that nobody can say for certain, and your essay should be careful here. Police believed that Desmond and Dominic were connected to a very large number of serious incidents over their 2 decades at the top, with some officers linking them to a shocking total. But believing something and proving it in court are 2 very different things, and most of those suspicions were never tested in front of a jury. What is certain is that the family was treated by police as one of the most serious problems in the entire region. The Noonan story began to unravel in the mid-2000s. In 2004, Damien lost his life in a motorbike accident, a sudden and ordinary kind of tragedy for a family used to far more dramatic dangers. The following year, in 2005, Desmond himself was attacked in the street in Manchester and did not survive. He was 45. In a chilling twist, his passing came just days before a television documentary aired in which he had boasted that he was better equipped than the police. That left Dominic as the last of the three big brothers, and he leaned fully into his own legend. He even changed his name by deed poll to an unusual new surname that was really a coded motto, a set of initials standing for the idea of rewarding those who stayed loyal and turning on those who crossed him. He appeared in documentaries, gave interviews, and seemed to enjoy his fame as a real-life Manchester gangster. Across his life, he gathered more than 40 convictions for things like the bank raid, fraud, escaping from custody, clashes with police, and possessing illegal equipment. But Dominic's story did not end as a folk tale. In his later years, the courts dealt with him again, and the picture that emerged was far darker than the gangster image he had sold. He was sent back to prison in 2015 for offences including arson, a plot to blackmail, and twisting the course of justice. Then came the most serious matter of all. He was convicted of grave offences against children and handed a long additional sentence on top of everything else. Whatever fearsome legend the Noonan name had built, it ended with one brother exposed as something no one could admire. For all their power, the Noonans were still a crime family in the old sense, a single family line at the centre of everything. But the next story on this list is about what happens when two families do not work together, but turn on each other. It is about a private feud in East Manchester that spilled far beyond the people involved, ending in a tragedy that shook the entire country, including the loss of two officers who were simply doing their job. Section 6. The Short and Atkinson families. The deadliest chapter in this whole story does not come from Moss Side or the city centre. It comes from the eastern edge of Greater Manchester, from ordinary streets in places like Droylsden, Clayton and Hattersley. And it begins not with a gang, but with a grudge between two local families, the Shorts and the Atkinsons. The feud between them went back about 10 years, and, like a lot of these things, it started over almost nothing. The court that later heard the full story was told it began around 2001 with something as small as a look, a moment of disrespect between members of the two families that turned into a fight. From there, it grew. There were more fights, between brothers, cousins and nephews on both sides, the kind of slow-burning hatred that never quite dies down and gets passed around a family like an illness. In 2003, it took a serious turn when the father of one of the families was attacked and badly hurt in the leg inside a pub. By then, this was no longer a falling out. It was a war waiting to happen. The man who had turned that long feud into a national tragedy was named Dale Cregan. He was a known criminal from the Tameside area, deeply involved in the local illegal trade, and he was closely tied to the Atkinson side of the dispute. Cregan was a striking figure, partly because he had lost an eye, though the stories about how he lost it have never fully been agreed on. People who knew him described someone who was openly willing to use fear and force to get his way, and who was treated with real caution long before his name was known across Britain. Everything came to a head in 2012. In May of that year, the old tensions flared up again, and Cregan decided to act. He went to a pub called the Cotton Tree in Droylsden, where a young man named Mark Short was drinking. Mark was 23 years old. Cregan carried out an attack inside the pub that took Mark's life and left 3 other men hurt. It was a planned, deliberate act, and it pushed the feud past any point of return. Cregan was arrested soon after on suspicion of being involved, but at that stage there was not enough evidence to charge him, and he was released. He used that freedom to do something even worse. In August 2012, he went to the home of Mark's father, David Short, who was 46. There, Cregan carried out another attack and also used a small explosive device, a level of brutality that shocked even people used to hearing about this world. In the space of a few months, he had taken both a father and his son. Now Cregan was the most wanted man in the country, and he went into hiding. What he did next is the part that turned this from a local crime story into one of the darkest days in the history of British policing. On the 18th of September 2012, Cregan made a false emergency call, reporting a fake incident at a house in Hattersley. It was a trap, designed to lure police officers to the address. 2 unarmed officers answered that call, believing they were dealing with a routine report. Their names were Fiona Bone, who was 32, and Nicola Hughes, who was 23. When they arrived, Cregan attacked them without warning and used an explosive device once again. Neither officer survived. They had gone to work that day as normal, expecting an ordinary shift, and they were taken in an ambush that had been set purely to harm whoever came through the door. The loss of 2 young officers in such a cold and planned way sent a wave of grief and anger across the entire country. Shortly afterwards, Cregan walked into a police station and handed himself in. The case that followed was enormous. Dale Cregan stood trial at Preston Crown Court alongside a group of other men connected to the various attacks, including the man the prosecution said had helped set the feud in motion. The trial was long and hugely expensive, with a heavy police presence every day. Then, partway through, Cregan changed course. In February 2013, he admitted that he was responsible for the loss of the 2 police officers. A few months later, he also admitted ending the lives of Mark and David Short. He had carried out 4 of these acts in total, and he had also tried to take the lives of 3 other men at that pub. On the 13th of June 2013, the judge handed Dale Cregan a whole life sentence. That is the most serious punishment the British justice system can give. It means there is no minimum term and no chance of parole. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars and never walk free again. For a case built on a petty family grudge that spiraled completely out of control, it was the only ending that made any sense. What makes the Short and Atkinson story so haunting is how small the original spark was. A look, a few harsh words, a fight outside a pub. None of it had anything to do with the 2 police officers who paid the highest price of all. 2 women who had never been part of any feud and who simply did the job they were sworn to do. That is the cruel truth at the centre of so many of these stories. The people who start the fight are rarely the only ones who pay for it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Our next chapter moves a few miles west to Salford, a place with its own long and proud criminal history. There, a bitter split between former friends would lead to the most famous gangland figure in the city being taken outside his own front door, and to the rise of a quiet, ruthless professional the press would come to call the Iceman. Section 7. The Salford A-Team and the Fall of Paul Massey. Salford sits right next to Manchester, almost close enough to touch. But it has always had its own identity and its own criminal world. And for years, one name stood above all others in that world: Paul Massey. Massey was not a quiet, hidden figure. He was famous in Salford, almost a local celebrity. Back in 1992, during a period of unrest in the area, he was given the nickname Mr. Big, and it stuck for the rest of his life. He ran a security business, putting people on the doors of clubs and venues, and he had a long criminal record behind him. But there was another side to him too. He once stood as a candidate to become the elected mayor of Salford, talking openly about wanting to keep local young people out of trouble. To the police, he was a top-level target. To many locals, he was a kind of folk hero. The truth, as always, sat somewhere in between. As he got older, Massey became a mentor figure to a younger group known as the A-Team, the most powerful crime crew in Salford. Its leader was a man named Stephen Britton, who looked up to Massey almost like a father. For a while, the A-Team ran things in Salford with a firm grip. Then, in 2015, the whole thing fell apart from the inside. The cause was almost unbelievably small. The trouble is said to have started with an argument in a club, where a drink was thrown and a woman was struck. In that world, an insult like that cannot go unanswered, and the A-Team split into two bitter halves. On one side stood Britain and the original crew, with Massey as their respected elder. On the other stood a breakaway group led by a man named Michael Carroll. What had been one gang became two enemies, and the streets of Salford turned into a battleground of attacks, threats, and revenge. The most shocking moment came on the 26th of July, 2015. Paul Massey arrived home at his house in Clifton, Salford, in the evening. As he got out of his car, a man dressed in dark clothing was waiting nearby. Massey was attacked in his own driveway, struck many times, and despite trying to take cover, he did not survive. He was 55 years old and a father of 5. The most famous gangster in Salford had been taken down outside his own front door, and the message it sent through the underworld was impossible to ignore. But it did not end with Massey. A few months later, in October 2015, the feud produced one of its most sickening moments. Members of the A-Team went to a house in the Winton area of Salford, looking for a man who was friendly with the rival Carroll faction. When the door opened, it was not that man standing there. It was his wife and their 7-year-old son, Christian Hickey. Both the boy and his mother were attacked on their own doorstep, and Christian was badly hurt in the legs. Thankfully, after a long stay in hospital and several operations, he survived and slowly learned to walk again. But the idea that a gang would target a child over a grown men's feud showed just how far things had fallen. The story then went quiet for a while, but it was not over. Massey had a close friend named John Kinsella, a well-known figure from the Liverpool underworld who had once been asked to warn off a man bothering the footballer Steven Gerrard. Kinsella had been a pallbearer at Massey's funeral. In May 2018, almost 3 years after Massey, Kinsella was out walking his dogs with his pregnant partner near his home in Merseyside when a man on a bicycle rode up behind him and attacked him. Kinsella did not survive. The two events, years apart, were clearly connected, carried out in the same careful, professional way. The man behind both was named Mark Fellows. The press gave him the nickname the Iceman because of how cold and calm he was about what he did. Fellows was, in plain terms, a professional, hired to carry out these planned attacks for money. He belonged to the Carroll side of the Salford split, the enemies of Massey and the A-Team. For a long time it seemed he might get away with it, because he was careful and left little behind. But he made one mistake, and it was a strange one. Fellows was a keen runner, and he wore a GPS watch that tracked his routes, the same kind thousands of ordinary joggers use. Before the Massey attack, he had quietly walked the route to plan it out, and his watch recorded every step of that practice run. When police later found the watch and read the data, it placed him exactly where he should never have been. A simple fitness gadget did what years of fear and silence had stopped witnesses from doing. It told the truth. In January 2019, after a long trial at Liverpool Crown Court, Mark Fellows was found guilty of the loss of both Paul Massey and John Kinsella. The judge gave him a whole life sentence, meaning he, like Dale Cregan, will never be released. His associate Stephen Boyle was found guilty in connection with Kinsella and also jailed for life. Several members of the A-Team were later sent to prison for the doorstep attack on young Christian Hickey and his mother. The war that began with a thrown drink in a club had cost lives, shattered families, and ended with its key players locked away for good. The age of the loud, public gangland figure like Paul Massey was fading. What replaced it was something far quieter and harder to spot. The new crime families would not pose for cameras or run for mayor. They would hide in plain sight, behind ordinary front doors and encrypted phones, including one father and son who turned a normal-looking property into something far more dangerous. Section 8. The Mulligan Family. The stories we have told so far were loud. They came with feuds, funerals, and headlines. But the most modern kind of Manchester crime family looks nothing like that. It does not want fame, it does not pose for documentaries, and it tries very hard never to be noticed at all. To see what a crime family looks like in the 2000s, we can look at the case of a man named James Mulligan and his relatives. From the outside, there was nothing dramatic about the Mulligans. James Mulligan was a young man from Hyde, on the eastern side of Greater Manchester, born in the early 1990s. There were no dramatic public showdowns in his story, no nicknames splashed across the front pages. Instead, he sat quietly at the top of an organised crime group that pushed huge quantities of illegal substances across the northwest of England and into North Wales. It was, in every sense, run like a business, with a clear chain of command and people assigned to specific jobs. Below Mulligan were his trusted lieutenants, the men who moved the product and the money from place to place. Below them were the people who actually sold to customers on the ground. It was an organised pyramid, and like any business, it depended on routine. Goods needed collecting, money needed counting, deliveries needed making, again and again. That routine made them efficient, but it would also, in the end, be the thing that destroyed them. What made this case a true family story was who else was involved. As police dug deeper, they found James Mulligan's own father and brother, Brian Mulligan Sr. and Brian Mulligan Jr., working inside the same operation. A father and his son were responsible for one of the most disturbing parts of the whole setup, a homemade lab where dangerous illegal substances were being produced. This was not a one-off, it was, quite literally, a family trade, passed between generations and run out of ordinary houses where nobody would think to look. And that is the most chilling detail of all. The places where these substances were made and stored were not hidden bunkers or warehouses on the edge of town. They were normal homes on normal streets, in areas like Ashton-under-Lyne and Droylsden. From the pavement, they looked like any other house on the road. Behind the front door, they were the centre of a serious criminal operation. One of the storage houses was even looked after by an older woman the gang nicknamed Grandma, a detail that captures just how strange and ordinary this world had become. It was not flashy gangsters in fast cars. It was family members and a so-called grandma quietly minding the goods. The investigation that brought them down began in 2021, led by the Specialist Organised Crime Unit at Greater Manchester Police. Detectives spent months watching the group, learning their patterns and following the trail of deliveries across the region. Between the spring and autumn of 2021, that quiet surveillance turned into action, with arrests and seizures as the gang were caught moving goods, cash and equipment from one place to the next. Officers from neighbouring forces in Merseyside and West Yorkshire joined in because this network reached far beyond a single town. Slowly and patiently, the police built up a complete picture of who did what. One moment in particular showed exactly what kind of people they were dealing with. During the surveillance, James Mulligan and one of his top men was stopped by police as they drove back from Liverpool. Inside the car, officers found illegal equipment hidden in the glove compartment, around £25,000 in cash, and a pair of throwaway phones, the kind used by people who do not want their conversations traced. It was clear proof that this so-called ordinary family was moving both serious money and dangerous goods around the country. The case took time to bring to court because untangling a whole network of family members, lieutenants and sellers is slow, careful work. But in November 2023, at Minchell Street Crown Court in Manchester, the final pieces fell into place. In total, 11 members of the group were jailed, with sentences adding up to almost 70 years between them. James Mulligan, the man at the head of it all, received more than 11 years. His father and other members were sentenced too, with the punishments reflecting how serious and far-reaching the operation had been. The officer who led the investigation summed it up well, describing how a case that started with a handful of suspects grew into a network of around 13 people, supplying both illegal substances and dangerous equipment across Manchester and beyond. He pointed out something important too, that this gang believed they were untouchable, and that all they really cared about was making money. There was no grand cause here, no twisted code of honour. There was only profit, and a willingness to poison their own communities to get it. The Mulligan case matters because it shows how much the Manchester crime family had changed. The old names ruled through fear and reputation, out in the open, daring the world to challenge them. The new ones try to disappear into everyday life, running their trade like a quiet family firm from a terraced house, hoping that being boring is the best disguise of all. In many ways, that makes them harder to catch than the gangsters of the past. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the Mulligans were brought down the old-fashioned way, through patient watching and a lucky car stop. The next family on this list was undone by something far more modern and far more powerful. For years, the most careful criminals in the country believed they had found a perfect way to talk in total secret, until the day police cracked that secret wide open and read every word. And waiting inside that flood of hidden messages was yet another father and son. Section 9. The Gresty Family and the Cracked Network. If the Mulligans showed how a modern crime family hides in plain sight, the next story shows how even the most careful of them can be undone in a single stroke. To understand it, you first have to understand a strange piece of technology that quietly changed the entire criminal world. For years, the smartest criminals in Britain had a problem. Phones can be tapped, messages can be read. Talk too freely, and the police will hear every word. Then, around the late 2000s and 10s, a solution appeared. It was a special encrypted phone network, and the company behind it promised something close to total secrecy. The phones had no normal apps, no cameras in some versions, and messages that could be set to wipe themselves. Each user picked a code name, called a handle, so nobody had to use their real identity. Criminals across Europe rushed to buy these phones, believing they could now plan anything they liked without ever being caught. They spoke openly, confident that no one was listening. They were wrong. In 2020, police forces across Europe, working together, managed to break into that network. Suddenly, investigators could read millions of messages that the criminals had assumed were completely private. It was like quietly slipping into a locked room where every gangster in the country was talking out loud about their business. Across the country, the network had well over 10,000 users, and cracking it set off a wave of arrests that is still being felt years later. Greater Manchester was hit especially hard, and one network after another was taken apart because their own words, typed in total confidence, had become the evidence against them. One of those networks was a family operation based in Salford, centred on a father and his son. Their names were Christopher Gresty and Louis Gresty. Christopher was the older man, born in the 1960s. His son Louis was in his early 20s. Working alongside a third man named Ricky Lee, they ran a steady trade in illegal substances across the Salford area, and they too had relied on those secret phones to do it. What makes the Gresty case so interesting is how ordinary and how greedy it all looks once you read the details. This was not a story of attacks or turf wars. It was a story about money, and about people who thought they had found an easy way to get rich. The son, Louis, sold product on the street, and father and son used his bank account to take payments straight from customers, treating a serious criminal enterprise like a casual side business that could run through everyday banking. there was a darker, more dishonest streak running through their operation too. The group did not only sell to customers, they also cheated other criminals. Investigators found that they were taking blocks of product, watering them down to make them go further, and then selling the weakened version on as if nothing had changed. To hide what they had done, the father, Christopher Gresti, bought a special press, a machine that could squeeze the watered-down product back into solid blocks so that buyers would not notice it had been tampered with. The clever part for the police was simple. He paid for that machine with his own credit card, leaving a clear paper trail that led straight back to him. That was the pattern across this whole world of secret phones. The criminals felt so safe that they stopped being careful. The third man, Ricky Lee, even bragged in his messages about how much money he was making, describing a large sum of cash as nothing more than half a day's work. He spent freely, splashing out thousands on himself, and even throwing a party at his home during the national lockdown, at a time when most people were stuck indoors and following the rules. Every boast, every careless message was being quietly recorded and read by the very people he was trying to avoid. When the time came, the police moved in. Officers carried out searches at the family's home addresses, first in 2021 and again in 2022, gathering the physical evidence to sit alongside the mountain of messages they had already pulled from the cracked phone network. Faced with the weight of their own words, the men did not try to fight it. All three pleaded guilty before the case even reached a full trial. In November 2023, at Manchester Crown Court, Christopher Gresti, his son Louis, and Ricky Lee were sentenced. Between the three of them, they were given a total of around 28 years behind bars. A father and son who had treated the illegal trade like a family firm were now going to prison together, brought down not by a rival gang or a witness brave enough to talk, but by their own confidence in a phone that turned out to be anything but private. The Gresti story is a small one compared to the gangland wars of the past. There were no funerals, no front-page tragedies, no children caught in the crossfire. But that is exactly why it matters. It shows where the Manchester crime family ended up, as a quiet, money-driven business run from ordinary homes, betrayed in the end by the very technology it trusted. The fear and the menace of the old days had been replaced by spreadsheets, bank transfers, and code names on a secret phone. And that brings us, finally, to the hardest part of this whole story. For all the families, bosses, and enforcers we have followed, there is one group we have barely mentioned, and they paid the highest price of all. They were not gangsters or players in any feud, just ordinary people, some of them only children, who happened to be in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. Their names deserve to be remembered far more than any crime boss, and that is exactly where we go next. Section 10. The human cost. We have spent this whole journey talking about the powerful, the bosses, the enforcers, the families who built their names on fear. But behind every gang war, every feud and every deal, there were people who never chose any of it and who lost everything anyway. This final chapter belongs to them, and it belongs above all to two boys. The first was named Benji Stanley. On a Saturday in January 1993, 14-year-old Benji walked into a small takeaway shop called Alvino's on Weston Street, in the heart of Moss Side. He was simply waiting for food, standing in the queue with a friend, doing the most normal thing a teenager can do. He had nothing to do with any gang. He was not a player, not a runner, not involved in the trade in any way. He was just a boy getting something to eat. While he stood there, an attacker came in and targeted him, and Benji did not survive. He was 14 years old. The whole of Manchester was stunned, because this was not a known face from the underworld. This was a child, lost in a place that should have been completely safe. What made it even more painful was the strong belief among police that Benji was not even the intended target. At the time, Moss Side was at the absolute peak of the war between the Gooch and the Doddington, and attacks were frighteningly common. The theory was that Benji had been mistaken for someone else, partly because of the clothing he was wearing and the bicycle he had with him that day, which were linked to a friend of his. In other words, a 14-year-old may have lost his life simply because someone got the wrong boy. Nobody has ever been charged for what happened to Benji Stanley. More than 30 years later, his case remains open, and the people who know the truth have stayed silent. Benji's loss became a turning point in how Manchester talked about its gang problem. For years, much of the public had treated the trouble in Moss Side as something that happened to criminals, a world that decent people could safely ignore. Benji shattered that idea in a single, horrible moment. If a 14-year-old could be taken while queuing for food on a Saturday, then nobody was truly safe, and the city could no longer look away. You would hope that a tragedy that big would change things for good. It did not. 13 years later, in 2006, Moss Side took almost the exact same blow all over again. His name was Jesse James, and he was 15 years old. On a September night, Jesse had been out with friends in the area, doing the ordinary things teenagers do on a warm evening. Late that night, the group cycled into a local park, a place called Broadfield Park that locals knew simply as The Wreck. As they reached the middle of the park, something happened in the darkness, and the boys scattered and ran. When the noise stopped, Jesse was not with them. His friends could not find him in the dark. In a detail that is almost unbearably sad, they ended up calling his mobile phone, and then followed the sound of the ringtone through the park until they found him. Jesse James did not survive that night. He was 15, and, like Benji before him, there is no evidence he was involved in any gang. He was a teenager in a park who should have simply gone home. Once again, the city was left searching for answers that never fully came. The police treated it as one of their most serious cases, and over time they offered one of the largest rewards in the history of Greater Manchester Police, £60,000 for information that would lead to a conviction. Jesse's mother, Barbara Reed, became a powerful and heartbreaking voice, pleading again and again for anyone who knew something to come forward and speak out. She talked openly about the pain of waiting for justice, of dying inside while the people who knew the truth said nothing. As with Benji, no one has ever been brought to court for what happened to her son. Years on, the case is still unsolved, and the reward still stands, but the answers have never come. These two cases, 13 years apart, tell you everything you need to know about the real price of Manchester's crime families. The bosses we have discussed lived in a world of money, reputation, and revenge, but the bill for that world was very often paid by people who never entered it, who were simply nearby when the worst happened. Benji and Jesse were not the only innocent ones. Other families across Manchester and Salford have buried sons, daughters, brothers, and parents who were never part of any feud. They are the true victims of every story in this video. There is one more thing both cases share, and it is perhaps the saddest part of all: the silence. In both, people in the community almost certainly knew or could guess who was responsible. But the same fear that powered these gangs, the same code that kept witnesses quiet in courtrooms across the city, also kept mouths closed when two innocent boys lost their lives. The very thing that let the crime families thrive was the thing that denied these families their justice. So as we close out these 10 stories, it is worth holding on to the right names, not the bosses and enforcers who chased power and mostly ended up behind bars or worse, but Benji Stanley, Jesse James, and the many ordinary people like them. In the final part of this video, I want to step back from the individual cases and ask the bigger question that ties them all together: what these families really did to Manchester, and what their long and painful story actually teaches us. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.